The Taliban has taken over Afghanistan. That's a good thing. The US literally essentially begins the official pullout after, by the way, completely violating every single agreement they made with the Taliban under Trump the previous year, which essentially made any sort of further negotiations impossible. So the US starts that pullout, and literally immediately the Taliban rolls over everything. And I'm telling you right now, the Taliban didn't win battles. This was not like a military victory. There's no pivotal battle here to point to. There's no crushing military defeat for the Afghan army. What happened is that the Afghan government was simply a US puppet the entire time. And me and many other people seem to have underestimated that factor. You know, you don't have people like the very second that their benefactor state starts pulling out, you don't have like military generals and stuff just immediately going over to the Taliban with all of their troops. That doesn't happen unless the people in the army never even remotely believed in the cause in the first place. That's a factor that I failed to account for. Because the Afghan National Army was far militarily superior in terms of numbers, technology, everything. You know, they have like an actual air force. They have actual military fighting vehicles, stuff like that. The Taliban, on the other hand, is basically like outnumbered 10-1, and they're a purely infantry force with like some improvised mechanized infantry here and there, right? Yet they didn't have to fight because the second that the US starts seriously leaving, everyone just starts defecting in droves. And the reason why that happens, lamentably, whether you want to admit it or not, is because the Taliban is a lot more popular and seen as more legitimate than most people want to admit. And the US-backed puppet government, which I think at this point it is completely accurate to call it a puppet government. There's no other way to put it. It's exposed as a puppet government at this point. It's an accurate term. The US-backed puppet government literally had no legitimacy at all. No one thought that this was something that was worth putting their lives on the line to protect. There was literally zero will. It's almost impressive how little will there was. Honestly, like, this is like less will to defend the state than what you saw, for example, at the end of the Cuban Revolution when Cuban army soldiers started defecting to the 26th of July movement led by Fidel Castro in droves. This was faster than that. Even in South Vietnam, for example, where the South Vietnamese government was a legitimate US puppet, people still held out for years because there was a minority, but yeah, a sizable minority of people who were either forced to fight by higher-ups who believed in that state or who actually believed in that state themselves and who decided to fight voluntarily. But in Afghanistan, there was none of that. No, there was no one who was even willing to like force my troops to go in there and fight the Taliban. They were just like, you know, fuck this, I'm joining the Taliban. Come with me, boys. That's what happened. So what happened here is two things. One, a gross underestimation of the Taliban's legitimacy. Massive underestimation caused by the fact that most of us have been trusting of these polls that were coming out from there, that I think at this point you can't really deny that they were not representative of the population even remotely. They were clearly heavily biased towards Afghan government stronghold areas because, you know, the pollsters clearly couldn't get really good representative samples. I honestly think it seems to me like even the US people who believed in this sort of nation building project grossly overestimated the legitimacy of the Afghan government. Like, I thought it was a bullshit puppet before this, but I didn't think it was this much of a bullshit puppet. You would have thought that at least like in the metropole, there would have been like in the metro areas, there would have been people who were down to fucking defend this puppet state set up by the USA. Not even there though. Immediate collapse. So what you had here was basically, in the end, it was essentially just a micro state that only represented like the metropolitan areas of Kabul. No legitimacy whatsoever. Like the Taliban literally just rolls in, and in terms of like economic activity, daily life, things just keep going as if nothing had ever happened. You know, aside from all the people in the metropolitan area of Kabul desperately trying to evacuate the country because it was a state in which, you know, they obviously liked, they collaborated with, they're afraid of the Taliban now, obviously. But those are like the people who this puppet state actually was held up by, represented in Afghanistan. And the very second that the US starts its withdrawal, you basically get the sheet taken out and you see what this really was. A complete puppet state with no legitimacy whatsoever. So lamentably, you kind of have to admit here, the Taliban is seen as a lot more legitimate in Afghanistan than anyone at least in the West, really thought it was. Outside of Kabul and a couple of other big metropolitan areas, it's clearly had no legitimacy whatsoever because the second that the US troops started withdrawing and the Afghan's army is like, well, do we even really want to be here? And everyone asks themselves that question. They're just like, no, let's go fucking join them. If there was an actual battle, any sort of actual real conflict between those two forces, it at the very least would have been like a stalemate, because obviously the Afghan military was theoretically militarily superior, but there was no fighting. There was very little fighting. And it's almost impressive how much this shows how fucking ludicrous it was that anyone could ever have legitimately believe that what the US was doing in Afghanistan is a good thing. Literally 20 years of war for nothing. Not even winning the hearts and minds over to democracy. It's very clear that most people in Afghanistan, or at least a huge amount of people in Afghanistan, still very much agree with the Taliban, or at least see the Taliban as a legitimate sort of government, as a legitimate force of leadership. 20 years of bloody, chaotic civil war for absolutely fucking nothing. Hasn't even changed anyone's fucking mind. Kabul was always a metropolitan sort of area, which was more liberal, so to speak, than the rest of Afghanistan. Absolutely not representative of the rest of the country at all. And this is the biggest, the biggest fuck you to people who don't really know these things. I think a lot of people also have this sort of misinterpretation of how weak states like the Afghan state as well work. When you have a weak state, one without a really long history of a civil service. For example, the Indian state is fairly strong for its level of wealth, and because it has a big history of a civil service, etc. It reaches a lot of places that you wouldn't expect it to, but it's still most poor places, rural places in India, for example, are totally abandoned by the state. They have very little authority there. It's basically community rule. In Afghanistan, can you imagine how ineffectual the reach of the puppet state set up by the US was in Afghanistan this entire time? People seem to think that it was a legitimate government, but fact of the matter is, aside from big metropolitan areas, it didn't really have any sort of physical state presence anywhere. In the West, we have this idea that if there's a state, it has control of everything. It has this sort of pervasive monopoly on violence everywhere. It's the force that dictates everything, right? But that's not how things work. I've gone over this in my videos on the Shining Path in Peru and Fujimori in Peru as well. It's honestly impressive how quickly everything has collapsed. And it's really funny to me, the people whose response to this happening is the US should have stayed in there. For what, man? To prolong a civil war? To protect the metropolitan areas of Kabul? I'm sorry, but for people who consider themselves to be utilitarians who want harm reduction, you don't really seem to be that. It seems more like you just have a bit of sour grapes that the US fucking failed miserably in another illegal war that it had no business starting in the first place. Afghanistan under Taliban rule is going to be better than what it has been since the US invasion in 2001. If you think that a country that was already an incredibly conservative Islamic state, right, even in the minuscule areas where the government actually had a reasonable state presence that did anything effectual in enforcing their laws, even if you think that this marginally less reactionary government was great and awesome, etc., right? That is not better than Afghanistan not being in a perpetual state of civil fucking war and chaos and bombings and shit every 2 days, man. Controversial opinion. Actually, not controversial at all. Iraq under Saddam was better than Iraq now. And it was especially better than Iraq 10 years ago. You know why? A stable dictatorship is better than a failed state that is nominally a democracy, but not actually anywhere, because this so-called democracy has absolutely no power or legitimacy inside most of its territory, okay? This entire idea of nation building that the US imperialists love to talk about, it's not nation building at all. You're not building a nation. All you're fucking doing is failing miserably. You're creating shitty little puppet states that no one believes in, and murdering hundreds of thousands of people in the process, ruining the lives of hundreds of thousands more, causing complete and utter chaos for hundreds of thousands, millions more. If you're so fucking concerned about women's rights, why are you concerned about women's rights in Afghanistan? Where's the concern for women's rights in Saudi Arabia? Or like the 100 other fucking states in the world that all have abominable records when it comes to this sort of thing. This is just sour grapes, people who haven't even cared about Afghanistan at all, so who suddenly are pretending that they're crying about this, essentially because they're just pissed off that the US got murked. They're just pissed off that, their US nationalism, their US nationalist sentiment is butthurt because the illusion that the US does good things and, wins the hearts and minds of people by giving them democracy and women's rights is just being completely fucking shattered by the fact that no one cared about any of this, to the point that the Taliban literally walked into Kabul with no resistance whatsoever. The military, who they spent 20 fucking years training and arming, just said, okay, well, they're not here anymore. I'm going to go over to those guys. I like them better. None of this shit is worth defending. Even if you believe in US imperialism on like a theoretical level, I've never seen anything that is a better indication of the fact that it just doesn't work. Even if you believe in it on like a moral level, it's just a complete failure. None of it accomplishes any of the things that like the PR firms tell you that it's actually setting out to do, which, it's obviously not actually setting out to do. The reason why the war in Afghanistan has been upheld for all this time is plain as day to see at this point. It's because it made money. The perpetual war made money for arms companies. It's not even about geopolitics for the US anymore. It's not about that geopolitical position. It's just about the fucking money going to arms companies, going to PMCs, going to these massive billion-dollar industries. Not even about resources. That's what it was really about. The only people who've come out good from this are those companies. And I guarantee you that most of those people who died didn't even fucking want this puppet government. It was something that the US imposed upon them. If there's going to be change in Afghan society, if there's going to be change, if women are going to have better rights, if the Taliban is going to be either reformed or defeated, it's not going to be through a literal military fucking occupation, clearly. Because after everything that's happened, all that you've done is made the Taliban stronger. Not only literally, because now they control more of Afghanistan than they ever did before, but also in the minds of the people. Because quite clearly, they have more legitimacy than they did before. No one wants to fight against them anymore. No one at all. Before there were factions that fought against them. Now there's nothing. Honestly, impressive if it wasn't so sad. Like, it's such a huge failure. A huge failure of the ideology of American exceptionalism. It's like everything's laid bare here. People don't want what you think they want. It's really that simple. And it's difficult to admit that a lot of people have reactionary social views. There's a difference between admitting that a lot of people have reactionary social views and endorsing them yourselves. Because that's a reality that you need to work around, okay? You can't just say that these people have reactionary social views so they're all fucking irredeemable as human beings. No, you need to fix that somehow. You know how you fix reactionary social views, in most cases, aside from cough cough Saudi fucking Arabia, is with economic progress. Economic development. You know how you get economic development? You don't have a 20-year fucking long civil fucking war that you impose upon this country for no fucking reason whatsoever. I'm glad that the Taliban has taken over Afghanistan, and the reason for that is clear as fucking day. Everything can get better from here. The fighting will end. As long as the Taliban doesn't end up doing literal fucking Cambodia-esque genocide in Afghanistan, the stability that having no civil war and a central government that actually has control over all of its territory is going to bring to the country is going to be a legitimate progressive force. It's going to be a progressive force that brings the Taliban down eventually, 20, 30, 40 years from now. Because that sort of stability is what you fucking need for a country to develop to the point that these sorts of reactionary social views disappear. So all these people who are saying like, oh, I told you so. I told you this was going to happen. I fucking knew it. I knew all along that the US shouldn't have left because the Taliban would take over. Why did you want the US to stay? What do you think they would have accomplished? There were two options here. Two realistic options, or three realistic options, but one that was already off the table. One was that the US abided by its negotiations with the Taliban originally and helped to facilitate its discussions with the Afghan national government. The problem with that is One, the US violated the initial deadline on the withdrawal, which caused the Taliban to just essentially completely cut off communications and just stop caring. And two, quite clearly, as this complete capitulation of the Afghan government shows, they never had any sort of bargaining position in the first place because they have no legitimacy among the population. And that's what gives you your bargaining position. That's what makes you someone who's worth negotiating with. Otherwise, they're just gonna fucking walk in to the capital because even though you outnumber them from 10 to 1, all of your soldiers defected to them because they don't fucking believe in your state. The second thing that might have happened is that if the Afghan government was as legitimate as people believed before, and I certainly gave it a lot more credit than I should have, there would have been a perpetual civil war between those two sides. Like the US would have pulled out and the civil war essentially would have been the status quo, right? Just endless fucking fighting between the Taliban and the Afghan government. That is if the Afghan army actually fought, which they didn't at all. The third possibility is basically what happened. And of these three possibilities, obviously the first one was the best one. The main faction to blame for the capitulation of that possibility is the US for just completely fucking up whatever little good Trump did in actually starting negotiations with the Taliban in a meaningful way. The second best scenario is the second one, okay? None of these involve the US actually staying in Afghanistan. Because if the US stayed in Afghanistan, then it would essentially be like a US military adventure just to defend Kabul, just to enable a reasonable level of stability in the metropolitan area of Kabul, while the rest of the country is an absolute fucking chaos. Forever, for 20 more years. Is that what you want? No. It's better to have a stable, reactionary, theocratic dictatorship that can actually exert some level of control over the extent of its territory and run things day to day than an endless fucking chaotic war. So clearly, the Taliban being in control here is legitimately better than the other possible outcomes. At least the other possible outcomes ever since the US flagrantly sort of violated the deadline for the withdrawal earlier in this year, which made the Taliban withdraw from planned talks with the Afghan national government. Though even, as I said, the zero legitimacy of the Afghan national government makes even that tenuous. And the thing is here, like, if the US leaves, the Afghan government will lose to the Taliban. They weren't saying that in terms of the Afghan army is just going to all give up because they don't care enough to fight for the Afghan state, the puppet Afghan state. They were saying that in terms of that they thought that the Afghan military would fight and would lose, and that the Taliban taking over was something that was against the will of sort of the Afghan people. They claim to represent the Afghan people mostly baselessly, as is very clear at this point, considering the fact that no one considered this Afghan state actually to be worth defending. So those people were clearly thinking in sort of military terms, right? Like they were imagining a military victory. Well, those people were basically like, so we need the US to stay here to prevent this military defeat, right? But they were wrong about that, obviously. They were wrong about that because if the Afghan military had fought, they absolutely would have at the very least held out for quite a long time. I mean, winning is pretty impossible in Afghanistan, but at least held out and kept Kabul as a sort of, the metropolitan center, essentially a microstate within Afghanistan that's called Afghanistan for some reason. They also had this very weird idea that, like, keeping the US military in there to defend this Afghan state was somehow better than the alternative, which is like, why? And this argument was sort of based on the idea that the Taliban is unpopular while the Afghan national government is popular. And, more people want to uphold the Afghan national government than they do the Taliban. Well, lamentably, that has been proven not to be the case, quite emphatically, given the fact that literally no one wants to defend it, okay? Like, the entire idea was essentially like, justifying imperialism with imperialism. We're there, so we need to stay there until we fix it all magically, which we haven't done for the last 20 fucking years. We fucked it up, so it's up to us to fix the situation. You know what's going to fix the situation? The US just fucking leaving. Afghanistan under the Taliban, it's going to mean that if there is any sort of civil war, any sort of like conflict, it's going to be on a much smaller and less frequent scale that's going to allow sort of everyday life to actually happen. As I said earlier, if you're going to have either a full-scale military invasion, occupation, and a 20-year-long fucking never-ending civil war that essentially makes everyday life in the country impossible, or you're going to have a reactionary theocratic dictatorship, but that is worse than than what the government that only controlled Kabul really had, in terms of social, like reactionary social policies. I'm sorry, but it's going to be better to actually have the functioning state. Even if you believe in the morality of invasion to overthrow dictators, it's the same fucking reason why it was doomed from the very beginning, because you didn't end up with something that was better than what was there. This is why it doesn't really matter if you believe in the morality of US imperialism or whatever. As much as I think that that's a shitty position and makes you a terrible person, it doesn't fucking matter, because it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Even if you believe in the mythology, the myth making around all of this, it just simply doesn't work, man. You think that you would have worked that out by now. It makes things significantly worse. So much worse. Afghanistan would have been better off with 20 years of the Taliban before. Okay? If none of this had happened. Far better off, including all of the oppression of women. It would have been far better off. You know why? Because I'm sorry, but your life is better as a woman if you have to wear a burqa, but you're not going to be blown up in a fucking drone strike. You're not going to be blown up in a fucking car bombing. You don't have to leave your home because it becomes a battleground in a civil war, okay? Stability is by far the most important thing. You combat these things, these reactionary social views, with stability. You're not going to fucking get rid of them in the midst of a fucking 20-year-long civil war that apparently a lot of people wish had lasted a lot longer. I don't think that the Taliban is remotely honest about anything. I think they're definitely going to do some reprisal killings at the very least. The question is, are they dumb enough to make themselves an international pariah and end up getting like the North Korea treatment? The sort of international community have shown time and time again they're totally fine with these incredibly reactionary Islamic states, provided that they're cooperative, provided that they keep up the veneer of human rights, that, or at least at least they're economically convenient. So as long as they don't step over that line, I don't even think that the people who pretend to care about this are going to continue pretending to care about it for long. So if you want to know the summary of the Afghanistan take here, I'm glad that the Taliban has taken over. I wish that this has happened 10 years ago. I wish this had happened 20 years ago. I wish none of this had ever happened. I wish the Taliban had been in power this entire fucking time. Afghanistan would be far better off for it. 20 years of lost economic and social progress, all gone. 20 years of organic political progress in Afghanistan, gone. All fucking gone. That's the tragedy here. It's not that the fucking Afghan puppet government, that at this point is clear as day just a puppet of the US, is gone, okay? That's not the tragedy. The tragedy here is that the invasion happened in the first place, and that these 20 fucking years of civil war for nothing but the profits of arms companies, not just 20 wasted years. Like, it's not that these 20 years were just wiped out. Not even that they were wasted. They were actively turned into an absolute fucking disaster, a fucking hellscape. Afghanistan went from being a poor rural country with prevalent reactionary social views that heavily oppress women, to being a poor rural country with heavily reactionary social views that is essentially 20 years behind where it started from now, with 100,000 people who have died, far more people who have had their lives ruined without particularly being killed. That's the tragedy here. The tragedy isn't the fall of the fucking illegitimate puppet government that clearly no one in Afghanistan gave a shit about. I hope the fucking imperialists out there who believe that the US has noble aims, but is just like a lumbering oaf, maybe think about this for a second here. Maybe think about that, because quite clearly that's not the case at all. You fail to even make people in Afghanistan think that what you were supposedly trying to do there, which, by the way, Biden is denying now. Biden said we were never in Afghanistan to give them democracy. We were there to prevent terrorism. So he's even denying the typical American exceptionalist invasion excuse now. You got to ask questions like, if the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was bad, why was it bad? I think it was bad because it essentially caused massive chaos, suffering, death, etc., etc. Not because the government that the Soviet Union was intervening on the part of was worse. They obviously were significantly better than the Mujahideen in terms of their economic policies, social beliefs, etc. It was bad because it was fucking futile from the very beginning, because at a certain point, just letting a government fucking fail rather than doing a full-scale military intervention and like doing everything that you possibly can to ensure that there will be nothing even resembling stability ever. You know, at a certain point, stability, you know, is better than spending 20 fucking years causing a chaotic fucking civil war and ruining the lives of millions upon millions of people. Like, the US never had good intentions here. The US was not in Afghanistan to build democracy. The puppet government was there essentially to act as their proxy within Afghanistan. They never cared about it at all. And it wouldn't have been better if they did, make no mistake, because even if they did care about that, it would have failed completely. Not to mention that, what the fuck gives them the fucking right to just invade a country and decide that they have the right to overthrow its government and give these people something that at this point you have to fucking admit people in Afghanistan do not want. Like, does that mean they want the Taliban particularly? No. But quite clearly, the Taliban is seen as significantly more legitimate than the US puppet government was. Otherwise, the Taliban wouldn't have been able to walk in to fucking Kabul barely firing a fucking shot, man. So like all the dumb like take havers out there, I'm going to talk about this later in the stream too, like the people who's like professional take havers, like their job is to like have an opinion on things. Doesn't matter if they know anything about the topic, they just need to have an opinion on it, okay? Like some of them were like, oh, the US pulling out of Afghanistan is going to be a tragedy. Oh, it's going to be so sad, the government is going to fall. They see this in like a video game point of view, right? For them, it's like a video game. Like for them, the good democratic Afghan state has fallen and it's being replaced with the evil theocratic Taliban. What a terrible day. But in reality, what's going to happen is that in 90% of Afghanistan, nothing is going to change in terms of social norms because they were always like this. And all of the country is going to be far more stable than it was during this fucking pointless civil war. Like, these people don't think about things materially ever. They don't think about actual on-the-ground realities. They think about things in terms of video game teams. This video game team is better on paper than that video game team, so I support the better on paper video game team. I don't really care about actual material consequences of what's going to happen. And that's incredibly ironic considering these are like the harm reduction sort of utilitarian people who are all about voting for Biden. The harm reduction stance here is one, the US should never have invaded. But since they invaded, the fact that the Taliban has finally fucking taken over is going to be better overall than endless occupation, endless civil war. Reactionary dictatorial government with stability, better than less reactionary, nominally democratic government with none of it. Okay? Simple fact. And if you doubt what I'm saying about the Afghan government's legitimacy, let me just bring up my browser for the only time during this entire stream. What was the turnout in the last Afghan election? Less than 10 fucking percent, man. So there's 9.7 registered voters, right? But in terms of actual eligible voters, not just registered, there's more than 20 million, okay? So turnout was like less than 10%, 6-7% in the last election in Afghanistan. This is the government that people are trying to sell as having been legitimate, even in the election in Afghanistan with the highest turnout since the US established this puppet state was 5 years earlier in 2014. 33% turnout. 33 fucking percent turnout. This is your legitimate government that you think has a legitimate claim to rule all of Afghanistan, not just Kabul? I don't like it either. But the fact of the matter is that Afghanistan is a poor country full of reactionary social views that are predominant there, not just among the Taliban, but among the general population. The general population, whether we like it or not, sees the Taliban as more legitimate. That's a matter for Afghanistan. It's not a matter for the US military. That's a matter for Afghanistan. If you genuinely want this to change, if you genuinely want some sort of better government to be formed in Afghanistan, however it may end up, the way to go about that is not US military intervention, it's not sanctions, etc. It's to let things happen organically with economic development and everything that results in. You know, the people of Afghanistan will overthrow the Taliban or will force the Taliban to reform when they think the way that you think they should think, or when they think the way that you think they thought beforehand, because quite clearly they don't. Sad as it is, quite clearly they don't.